Morning.
Morning. Good morning.
How's everybody doing? I took through high school. Comme si, comme ça. Okay.
It's
Like,
Friday. Yay.
yeah. Yay. Hi.
She's so adorable.
Yes. All right, so while we're waiting for people to filter in, how I haven't had a chance to grade it yet, but how did the first exam feel on Blackboard? I know it's weird, but what were your reactions? What can I improve for the next one?
I thought the format was good. I just felt like I didn't have enough time.
Same, yes. Same.
That's so interesting because people in person finish it really quickly. So I wonder what it is about the tech that like makes it take longer. So I'll take that into account and maybe like cut down on the short answers or something next time. Did the way of being able to ask me questions seem to work? Okay, that's good. I'm giving an exam to my intro class on Monday. There are 32 of them, so we'll see how that goes.
I think for me personally, I test better at school because that's the environment I'm used to, whereas here I have my cats and there's, you know, whatever else is going on. So it's really hard for me to like focus.
I get that. Yeah, there's a lot of psychological research actually about what they call state-dependent learning, that you do a lot better in the environment you're used to working in. I remember once in grad school, a friend of mine sat in my seat on exam day, and I was like, "You've got to move." And she was like, "What?" I was like, "State-dependent learning. You've got to move." And she was like, "Okay." And everyone else in the room was like, "State-dependent learning." Yeah, when I was in college, there was a big thing about like, you should wear the same perfume when you study, or cologne when you study and when you take the test, and like that would somehow help you remember. I don't know if there's actually anything to that more than anything else, but we do know that scent is tied to memory because the areas of the brain that process them are similar places. So, alrighty, so now we get into the real meat of the semester, and so we're going to start learning about all the different theories. And so, you know, there were psychologists who were theorizing about things as early as the 1870s. That's really when psychology began as a science. But the first person to really start thinking about personality and everything was Freud. So we always start with him. He's very problematic. We know that. I will talk about the ways he's problematic, as well as the ways that he did really things that contributed to the field quite a bit. So just side note, if any of you are taking English classes, especially upper level English classes, their department looks at him completely differently than we do. So they love him. They use his theories all the time. The vast majority of psychologists sort of say, yeah, he had some great initial ideas, but we've moved on from that with science. So just different opinions, different fields. Dr. Hawk and I have like a joking rivalry about this. So. Alrighty. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive right in. And just like our pieces readings, you'll see pictures of Freud, and I'll try to do that for all the theorists we talk about throughout the semester so we can see what they look like, the diversity or lack thereof, and we will go from there. All right, so I am going to screen share. La, 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 maybe. There we go. Didn't want to do it the first time. Okay. I tried to be funny with my Ode to Freud. I don't know if it's that funny, especially this early on a Friday. All right. So, like I said, Freud was really the first person to start thinking about all these things together, and he really tried to explain everything about people. I mean, he's honestly one of the only theorists who did that. Like, a lot of theorists had a lot of ideas, but Freud was the one who was like, I am going to explain everything ever. So not necessarily, it's certainly ambitious, difficult for anyone to do. We'll put it that way. Let me get my pointer to sync here. All right. Well, I'm close to the mouse today. All right. So a disclaimer. When he was teaching us about Freud, my undergraduate professor, Michael Levine, said this exact quote: I hate Freud. I used to write little Levineisms in the margins of my papers. I don't feel as strongly about Freud as all that. But I am critical of some of his ideas. And as I've been mentioning, Freud did try to explain everything about everything, which I think is really admirable. So he really did contribute in a lot of ways. But the problem with the vast majority of Freud's theories is that they cannot be tested empirically. Hey, I finally got it to work. Okay. Good morning. All right. So throughout the 20th century, Freud's ideas have had a huge impact on how the mind was understood. So not only in psychology or even just in literature, but also they influence things like, consumer markets. How do we do advertising to people? How we conceptualize things. His influence can still be seen today. So psychoanalysis, which he developed, is still used, particularly in wealthy areas where people can pay out of pocket. A lot of the concepts he came up with have continued into other forms of therapy. So, for example, transference, which we'll talk about later, is about sort of how the client might come to see the therapist in a role that's missing in their life. So, for example, like a mother figure or something like that. Any type of therapy, we try to be aware of that. And he laid the foundation for many topics and questions that psychologists are really still trying to address today. So though, again, we don't really take much stock in some of his theories now, he's very important historically. Essentially, if Freud didn't do Freud, right, all the other theorists we're going to talk about this semester would not have done their thing in the same way. Because essentially, all the theorists we're going to talk about were somewhat in reaction to Freud. And either proving him wrong or feeling like there was a piece missing from what he was talking about. So, I'm going to try and give you a bit of background on him because I think that helps conceptualize him. So he was born in what's now the Czech Republic in 1856. His father was a wool merchant. His family was Jewish. He didn't practice the Jewish faith, but he was conscious of his heritage and of his Jewish origin. His father was 41 when he was born. His mother was 21 when he was born. Okay, so sort of keep that dynamic in mind as we think about Freud. He was their first son. His mother was very loving and protective. His father was stern and authoritarian. Freud later on in his life did psychoanalysis on himself and felt that his feelings towards his parents were mixed with fear and love, respect and hate. So he was the favored son, and he was born with a small portion of the fetal sac covering his head, which they called a cowl. And according to folklore, this meant that he would be famous. So, like, you don't always take stock in folklore things. In this case, it was true, right? He had 6 younger siblings, 5 sisters and 1 brother. He was born an uncle because his father was a widower who already had grown children, and one of sort of his half siblings already had a child. So Freud's nephew, John. So they were very close in age. He was only like a year older than Freud. And many have suggested that it is, you know, Freud's unusual family constellation that really set the stage for a lot of his theories, particularly the Oedipal complex. Again, think about 41-year-old dad, 21-year-old, probably attractive mom. At age 4, his family moved to Vienna, and Freud lived there until the end of his life. So 1938, when he actually had to flee Vienna because it was overwhelmed by the Nazis. And this is actually something I don't get into too much in this class, but this is actually sort of a really sad story and an interesting anecdote of, you know, how things were for Jewish individuals during this time. So Freud was trying to leave, but because he was Jewish, the Nazis seized all his assets. So he didn't have access to his bank accounts. So he actually had to rely on other psychoanalysts to borrow money from them to leave. He actually took all of his furniture, all of his art, and he moved to London. And he actually spent the last few years of his life in London. As you can see, he moved in like 1937, 1938. He died in 1939. And he actually died of cancer. It was throat cancer, but it also affected his mouth and jaw. At the end of his life, he basically had like a hole in his cheek. So the scars, you know, weren't necessarily the most healthy things. So he, growing up, was a very good student, and he was given resources to pursue his studies at the expense of his siblings. So he was the only one who had his own room, and he was given candles or an oil lamp when his siblings didn't have access to those things. He wanted to be a mighty warrior or minister of state, but professional choices were actually very limited for Jewish individuals at that time. So he went to med school, and he became a physician, and in particular, he was a neurologist. He was trained as a neurologist. So he studied animal biology, in particular the nervous systems of fish and testes of the eel. He studied the anesthetic properties of cocaine, and he tried throughout his career to use cocaine as a potential antidepressant, and he later conceded that he suffered from its use, and some people think that he likely had an addiction to it by the end of his life. He depended on his private practice for a living. That's essentially how he got the money to allow himself time to write, and then he could present his scientific papers or publish his books. He became really interested in what at the time was called neurosis. So neurosis is what we would now really call anxiety, although there were other things sort of wrapped up in it. But it was an emotional disturbance where people could typically go around their daily lives, but they weren't functioning at the top level. So Freud's goal was to create a complete theory of humanity. So he hoped that studying neuroses would eventually provide a key to the study of psychological processes in general. He went to Paris to study with Jean Charcot, who was a psychiatrist. And actually, Freud was able to study with several different folks in his life before he started his own thing. And what got him closer was being trained in hypnosis by Joseph Breuer. So Breuer had invented what he called this talking cure, where he got clients to talk freely about their problems. And the way that Burr did it was through hypnosis. So he would put people into a relaxed state, sort of an altered state of consciousness. The hypnotic state is not exactly the same as, but similar to a meditative state. A lot of people think that it's like the clucking like a chicken, like comedy in hypnotist, but in fact, it allows you to be more relaxed and open to talk about these things. Oh, what was his goal? His goal was to create like one theory of human psychology. So, Freud and Burr worked together on a book called Studies in Hysteria that was published in 1895. And Freud started to think, like, do we actually need to hypnotize people to do this, or can we just get them to talk? So he and Burr started sort of breaking based on that. Freud got interested in what he called free association, where you just sort of had people talk and then help them pick up on themes. And Freud was already starting to really emphasize sexuality in his theories, and Burr just didn't think it was important in neurosis. And one thing I will say is almost every single person Freud worked with or that came after Freud who was a post-Freudian or a contemporary, this is what they broke with Freud on. Was the overemphasis on the role of sexuality, things about the Oedipal complex, all of those things. People just did not appreciate that. People were not into it. People thought that Freud was way too wrapped up in it. So this was a problem throughout his life. Now, another thing that it's important to realize about Freud to give, again, like a conceptualization of how he came up with these theories, right? So Freud was actually living in Victorian Austria. So non-reproductive sexuality, things like masturbation and homosexuality were seen as perverse. And then you didn't actually talk about sex really at all, right? That wasn't polite. And so you had what Freud saw as repression of fundamental drives because people were not talking about these things. The sexual act was considered beastly, and it was tolerated because of the shortcomings of men and because it was needed for reproduction. Natural excretory functions were viewed with shame. So people just didn't talk about sex. People, that when they had sex, sometimes it was just sort of quick and dirty. There are stories about people just like cutting a hole in the sheet, and that's what they had intercourse through. There were homes around this era that had 2 staircases, and the women went down one and the men went down the other. And the idea was that the men didn't accidentally see an ankle. Oh no, ankle. So it's a very interesting environment for Freud to start hypothesizing about these things and about the effects possibly of this repression. And so he thought that the prohibition of sexual behaviors and discussion even of sexual behaviors leads to neurosis, leads to anxiety, fear, worry, repression, and hysteria. But it's also important to note that this time was also a cultural renaissance in philosophy, in music, in literature. I mean, this is around the time like the French Revolution is happening, and you have all of the sort of Enlightenment speakers and thinkers. And more people were starting to question the prohibitions against sex and sexuality. And Freud proposed pleasure as an important underlying function of sex, which, at the time seemed sort of outlandish. But he was someone who said, this is a thing. This is part of why we do this. This is part of why the human species continues, right? So again, mentioning very briefly how his life went. So he continued to develop and revise his work until his death. So for those of you who have seen or are familiar with the story of Hamilton, how he was always sort of writing like he was running out of time, Freud was very similar. He was just always trying to figure things out. As I mentioned, he did die in 1939 in London from cancer of the jaw. He never really completed his complete theory of humanity, but to be honest, he got closer than pretty much anybody else. Another interesting thing is that a lot of archival data isn't yet released by his estate. So there are things that he has written about that we don't necessarily have yet. He also had some really interesting ideas. So here you can see his dog, and he noticed that a dog's presence acted as a calming influence on his patients, and they seemed better able to disclose painful information with a dog nearby. And so it seemed that the presence of a dog in the room lowered the barriers of resistance that all humans seem to erect to avoid painful subjects, and so facilitated the therapeutic process. So I guess in theory, his dog was sort of the first therapy dog. So again, he had lots of different ideas. It was almost like he had too many ideas in his head and just could never get them all out. Alrighty. So Freud's theory is called psychodynamic. And yes, the Sigmund Freud action figure exists. Dr. Jackson has one in his office if anyone wants to see one. Freud, believe it or not, as much as we today criticize him for not being that scientific, Freud wanted to be scientific. He wanted psychology to be as scientific as fields like biology or physics. And so this term, psychodynamic, the term dynamic here means force, and Freud was trying to liken it to thermodynamics, right, in physics. And psycho or psyche means mind, soul, spirit. So the term psychodynamic emphasizes the interplay of the forces of the mind. And Freud really, sort of his whole theory is predicated on the idea that some of these forces are outside of our conscious awareness. So conflict is really the core of psychodynamic theory. And it's these conflict between the different forces in our mind. Alrighty. So if you've taken intro psych, you've probably heard the id, ego, superego ideas that Freud has, but he sort of started a little bit further back than that. And so he talked about just levels of consciousness. And one thing I'll say here, and I have this as a note on the bottom of this slide, is that a lot of people in sort of pop culture will refer to things as being subconscious, so under conscious awareness. Freud never used that term. To him, these things were unconscious. They were so far down that we were just not even aware that they were in our mind. Okay, so it wasn't that they were just under consciousness, it's that we were not conscious of them at all, unconscious. So he was interested in the mind as a space with depth. He was interested in what lies below the surface. And again, this is the mind we're talking about, so the abstract concept of the mind, as opposed to the actual physiological brain, okay? So he had some ideas about the brain, but the science wasn't quite there yet for him. So he really was thinking more about the mind, this abstract idea. So conscious here is at the surface. It just is what it sounds like. Things on the surface level, it interacts with external forces. They're things we are conscious of, that we think, that we feel. Okay? And then Freud said you go a little deeper and you're into pre-conscious. This includes images or episodes in your life. And he said the pre-conscious controls behavior, modifies the outside world, and helps to change behavior to fit conditions or change the world to fit you, right? So something as simple as, you might be like, how do you control the world? It's small, right? So when I was getting ready for the semester, this room had sort of just been our storage room. It was literally just covered in boxes. And I was like, I can't teach in that way, right? So my husband and I took control and we cleared everything out, right? So you can alter your world, or you can change your behavior to fit the conditions, right? I'm not going to campus because it's a huge risk for me. So we're doing it this way. We're making it work. The sensor, which is sort of the yellowish oval here, can border between the preconscious and the unconscious. It's a screen between them. It safeguards the unconscious from conscious awareness, essentially. But it's like a crooked customs agent. Essentially, stuff can get through, you know, through sort of smuggling, bribery. There's no real strength. Some people have made the analogy of like a screen door on a submarine, right? Like stuff can get in. But it's at least something, right? Like it should keep the mosquitoes out, in theory. But, you know, you open that door and they can come right in. So the unconscious is, again, really one of the things Freud is most interested in. These things we are not actually aware of. So this exists and operates completely outside of conscious awareness. So he talked a lot about the dynamic unconscious. So it was dynamic, it was full of forces, urges, drives, needs, passions, dreams, ideas, wishes, desires, and all of these things want to get out. They want to get out through the sensor. And they want to come out in our behavior, our words, our emotions. So again, the sensor's trying to hold it back because not all these things are appropriate, right, for operating within society. So the unconscious is capable only of wishing. It cannot become conscious under ordinary circumstances. So we consciously have no idea that we think or feel this way. So there's a tension buildup that often can't be described with words. That's charged with emotional tension, and that's when stuff can get by the sensor. And we'll talk next week about all the different ways that can happen. So this was Freud's initial idea, and as I mentioned, throughout his career, he was always revising, coming up with refinements, and this transformed into the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. So I really like this diagram from your book because it kind of shows how those two different ideas come together, right? So we've got our preconscious, our unconscious, our conscious, but we're also looking at how the typical things we know about for Freud map onto that. So Freud's biggest thing he thought really drove us, he really focused a lot of his theorizing on this, was the id. Really interestingly, Freud never actually used the word id, just like a translation. So he used the word ich, which literally translates to it. Okay, but for some reason when they translated Freud's work, they thought that Latin sounded fancier, so they used the id. But Freud, in his language, calls this the ich. So it means the it. It means something fundamental within us. This is the seat of the dynamic unconscious. It is ruled by what is called the pleasure principle. Remember, again, this was sort of shocking to people that Freud said, like, sex can be about pleasure. You know, so this drive for pleasure was what drove the id. And Freud called this fundamental hedonism. Like the idea is you just sort of like, if the id controlled everything, you just go for it. The best description I've actually ever heard of the id was Newbery. He described it as Cookie Monster, right? So if you're familiar with Sesame Street, it was like, me want cookie, me want sex, me want fight, right? Nom, 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 nom. And that's the id. And if you don't have the other, Sesame Street characters to rein Cookie in, right, that he would just sort of run amok. So this is we want the world and we want it right now. We want immediate gratification. There's a drive to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That sounds all well and good, but we know that's not always realistic, right? When you live in the real world. And we primarily act on this as infants and young children, Freud thought. Like that's when we see true id coming out. The id also uses what he called primary process thinking. I'll throw that in the chat for y'all. And we need a whiteboard over here. Something I didn't get. So primary process thinking is basically the way of thinking associated with the pleasure principle. So there's no logic to it. It's timeless. Opposites can coexist without problems. Opposites are not illogical according to the system. It's a very free thinking way of going about things. It flows very easily. And the idea of the unconscious only being able to be capable of wishing, that's primary process thinking. So again, it's free reign, but it can't change that into action. So if, however, something's going on and our preconscious isn't doing its job, these forces will express themselves. Sometimes this means we say and do things that we regret later. We have to discharge the buildup of tension in some way. And Freud's idea was that as we grow older, we should realize that we can't immediately satisfy all of our urges and impulses without being punished by society. And that's where the ego starts to come in. So the ego, and Freud, again, originally called this the preconscious. Okay, so those terms are very kind of describing the same ideas. Ego said the Freud develops. Freud said the ego develops as we grow older and realize that we actually can't just do whatever we want, right? We do have to sort of live within certain rules and regulations. The ego is aware of what will make you feel pain and helps you be rational about it. It detects tensions. It looks both inwardly and to the outside world. So here you can see the ego is sort of straddling the unconscious and the preconscious or the conscious. It's much more rational and realistic than the id. So it's ruled by what Freud called the reality principle. So the ego recognizes that the id has these wishes, these desires, but we have to operate in an acceptable manner and conform to society's expectation. The ego's main job is compromise. So it is getting all these other forces in the mind to compromise, right? So that we're not just paralyzed by these forces fighting. So compromise formation is the ego's main job. So find the middle course between the competing demands of motivation, mortality, and practicality, and also the many things a person wants at the same time. The result of these compromises, according to Freud, was what an individual consciously thinks, so what's up in the conscious, and what they do, so the actions that we actually see. The purpose of the reality principle is to effectively serve the pleasure principle. So it basically makes the pleasure principle happen, but in a socially acceptable way, right? So maybe we can't go just eat the whole tray of cookies, put out in an event, but we can let ourselves go have one or two, right? Those are the types of compromises the ego lets us have. And so the ego, again, is ruled by this idea of the reality principle. And this is linked to secondary process thinking. which it will help if I spell it correctly for you. There we go. Okay. So secondary process thinking is associated with being human. It's about knowing what is appropriate. It is about using memory, perception, planning, judgment, decision-making. So in modern neuropsychological terms, this would basically be our prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain that helps us organize, sequence, inhibit things we shouldn't do. So that is what the ego does, the secondary process thinking. Ego instincts are instincts of self-preservation, essentially. They allow the person to live in the real world and essentially not go around and like piss everybody else off all the time. All right, and then there is the superego. And the superego is governed by ideals and morals. So it's the representation of societal rules, mores, taboos, all of those things. Freud thought that this developed later in childhood. An interesting side note is that he thought that it never really developed in women because they were not active members of society in terms of being part of its government, etc. So he thought that women just never developed a superego, which is really interesting. Again, living in Victorian England or Victorian Vienna, sorry. Just the fact that like women are often some of the harshest protectors of society's rules and regulations. So it's sort of interesting to me that he didn't like make that connection. So he says the superego stores the moral rules and regulations and how to conduct oneself appropriately. So you can think of the superego as the super moral, the part of the psyche that always wants to function according to society's ideals. And how this differs from the ego is like, this is only conforming to society's ideals. It's like this, if the superego had its way, you would sort of be a robot, right? And always follow everything to your own detriment. And the ego allows you to say, you know, like, no, this societal regulation is dumb, so I'm going to do something else, right? And like find ways to navigate that again, still let you be part of society. So one of the ways that essentially the id and the superego end up functioning is like the literary concept of psychomachia. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's like the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder, right? So if you think of like cartoons, right, you've got the little devil telling you like, go eat all the cookies. And the little angel being like, you should never have any cookies. That isn't what society wants you to do. And so the ego is you in the middle and you go, I'm going to have one cookie. I think it's okay, guys, right? I like this diagram as well because it shows just how much of what we do is outside of our consciousness, right? So this is an iceberg, and the iceberg is always bigger under the water than above it, right? And this is part of the reason why the Titanic sank, is because they saw the iceberg too late, and the iceberg was already hitting them because it was bigger underneath. So Freud said the vast majority of what's going on in our mind is outside of our conscious awareness. It's under the water, we don't see it. Freud also had ideas about forces or instincts in life. These were, to him, the overall driving forces of why we do things the way we do them. So the first one is libido. And yes, it is not a coincidence that he used libido, which we often use now for sex drive, right? And it was used at that time too. But for Freud, it was more than just sex instincts. It was also the life drive or instinct. It was your drive to stay alive. It was your drive to like live your life to the fullest. It is about self-preservation, but also about preservation of the species, which obviously again ties into that sexual component for reproduction. As Funder puts it, sex is simply life. Sex is necessary for procreation, and enjoyment of sex is an important part of being alive. So much so that when we get to Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, he actually puts sex on the same level as like food and water. Then there was Thanatos. And so Thanatos was the death drive or instinct. And he said that this is the primary pervasive drive to destroy, including to destroy yourself. So this is how Freud explained things like suicide or martyrdom. And again, it's important to think about the context of Freud's life, right? So he was around for World War I, which was absolutely devastating to Europe, right? He saw the carnage. He believed, based on what he was seeing, that people genuinely enjoyed the aggression that is inherent in war. And it made him believe that the tendency to destroy had to be given equal footing with the life instinct, with the libido. He talked about this in terms of, again, the physics. Yes, like Thanos from the Avengers, exactly, same root word. Yeah, he talked about this with the concept of the physics word of entropy, E-N-T-R-O-P-Y. This is the basic force in the universe towards randomness and disorder. And essentially the concept of entropy in physics is that ordered systems tend towards disorder over time. And Freud thought people were the same way, basically. Nobody except Freud who followed him has made a big deal about the death instinct. People kind of said, he explained it, so they ignored it. Also, many later theorists didn't really believe in it. And it's sort of hard to wrap your head around, and very few people want to focus on this, right? That like we have a drive to kill ourselves and destroy ourselves, right? So I think that's another reason why people sort of avoided it. The main idea behind Freud's conception of Thanatos is that aggression is so common, it has to come from someplace. Freud had difficulty explaining this idea because people, again, have a really hard time swallowing the concept of having a drive to destroy yourself. Freud also talked about the fusion of instincts. He thought that every behavior had both libido and thanatos in it. And he talked about the doctrine of opposites. So he thought everything implies and requires its opposite. So again, you could think of this in terms of physics laws. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So he said life requires death. Happiness requires sadness. Extremes on any scale may actually be more similar to each other than either extreme is to the middle. And this is something, again, that comes up when we think about human behavior, human philosophies. So, example, after 9/11, again, I think I've mentioned to you all that I was in college at the time. We had a panel on our campus, and one of our religious studies professors said, fundamentalists of any religion are more similar to each other than they are to other people within their own faith. And the more you look at it, the more that makes sense. The other thing to think about is sort of the political spectrum. It's supposedly a line, but you get out to the extremes and it feels like it starts wrapping back around, right? Examples, I know people who are both very conservative and very liberal who refuse to use birth control, right? Different reasons. One is religious. The other is I don't want to put chemicals in my body. Like, who's going to tell them their body is actually made of chemicals, right? But you come to the same behavior. And we see some of this, and again, not his fault, but we see some of the same behaviors in the extreme Trump supporters as we see in the Bernie Bros, right? Again, not something Bernie himself is endorsing, but it wraps back around. So again, some of Freud's ideas really have some interesting thought to them that make us understand things more. So Freud linked his urges to the body. And this came from his background as a neurologist, right? As his training as a neuroscientist. In particular, he looked at what he called erotogenic zones. So these were parts of the body that are naturally sensitive to excitement. As such, Freud assumed that each of these areas also naturally generate tension and are related to instinct. And this is how Freud continued to develop his theory of dynamic consciousness while looking at how it relates to the body. So now it was not just about, okay, these theories in the mind all existing simultaneously, but how do those relate to the body? And also, this is how he starts to get at how do those things develop and change over time. So he starts to look at human development here. So he also saw the past pulling people back. So that really told him he needed to look at things developmentally. How does the past influence the present? Alrighty, so next we'll get into the psychosexual stages. That's a whole thing in and of itself. So I'm actually going to stop just a couple minutes early today so that we can do that all together on Monday. Stop sharing my screen here. So as per usual, I'll hang around for a few minutes if people have questions. And otherwise, have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye. Oh, Dr. Myers.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about, I missed it when you were talking about the secondary process thinking. Like, what was that again? Like the...
So it's basically the thinking based on the reality principle. So it knows what's appropriate, and it is like inhibition, judgment, planning. It's like, okay, Id, you want to go do whatever you want, but we actually like be a person, right? So
Right.
inhibit some of that.
Okay, cool. And then I just have another like question, like in general, about I know you said, or in the syllabus it talks about like extra credit. And I know, are there any studies that are out right now?
Not
that
yet. We're pretty close to getting, I think, some of the students out. And then like I should have one or two coming out fairly soon too. But yeah, I would say by the end of September, we'll probably see the first ones.
Okay, so would my login be the same? Because I took the intro to psych like last semester, so...
Yeah, you should have the same account.
Oh, okay, so like, yeah, that's awesome. So that way I can get, extra credit always helps, Yeah. Okay, so you'll let us know when they like start coming out, or how will that work? Or I'll just...
Yeah. So typically what happens is who's ever teaching 480, which in this semester is Dr. Ariel, will let me know, and then I can let y'all know.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.